AIAA, and we simply couldn't do without them. John is a longtime personal friend, Vice President for Space Exploration Business Development, but for those of you who look down your nose at business development, you got to have been a program manager before that. Atlas V has John Karas's thumbprints all over it. So John, thank you for your support, and please come to the podium.
Morning, everybody. There you go. Hey, Bob, I really run a line of business. I kind of graduated from BD to real program management, so I just didn't want to scare you there. Thank you very much. On behalf of my boss, Joanne McGuire, who is the leader of Space Systems Company for Lockheed Martin, and I'll say the 17,000 Space Systems Company employees, Lockheed Martin is very honored and pleased to host this year's conference, and of course it being the 45th Propulsion Conference and the Joint Conference with Energy, I think that is just fantastic. So we are honored and pleased to be the sponsor this morning and one of the executive sponsors for the whole conference. I just want to let you know that by combining these two conferences, I think you really have a totally unabridged set of sessions that really cover from one end of the spectrum, terrestrial energy, all the way to what it takes to do interstellar missions and things that go as complicated and as small as individual components to total mission integration. So I think this is a wonderful conference, and I hope everybody's looking forward to those things. What I think is also really important is the capstone of the conference on Wednesday. OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, will be here soliciting your inputs. So I know it's at the end of the conference, but if you could be here for that, that would be excellent. But most importantly, today for this morning, this being the summer of '09, which is the 40th anniversary of the first Apollo moon landing, we thought it was very appropriate and that we have a wonderful panel, an August panel, with us today to talk about the history of Apollo. So with no further ado, I'll turn it back over to General Dickman, and again, thank you all for coming.
John, thank you. Please pass on our thanks to Joanne and to Lockheed Martin. Unless you've been asleep for the last couple months, you are aware that we have just celebrated the 40th anniversary of Apollo 11. TV shows, celebrations all around the country. We are perhaps the last in the sequence of those. I'm not sure how many more are still going to come. My personal thanks to Ashwani Gupta, the technical director for both propulsion and energy. What a coincidence that you're together, for encouraging us to have this panel. Ashwani, and why don't you stand up and say hi to folks. Ashwani is one of my bosses. I've got AIAA has a board of about 35 members, and they're all engineers. Think about it. The focus this morning is going to be on the Apollo era, not on Apollo 11, not on the 40th anniversary. Essentially that period from President Kennedy's speech on the 25th of May, 1961, through Apollo-Soyuz into that period where we were waiting for the shuttle to come on. Certainly Apollo 11 is an event in history that I think all of us will remember or study if you weren't alive at that time. Perhaps the hallmark will be looked back on as the hallmark event of either that century or my guess is maybe that millennia, human beings going to off Earth. But that one small step that Neil took was just one step on an amazingly long and amazingly complex journey that this country took. Our panelists this morning were involved in every step of that process, from the formation of NASA to the end of the Saturn Apollo era and the transition into the shuttle. They were key players in the development, operations, on the booster, on the modules, and in the exploration itself. The format for the panel is I'm going to go through a brief introduction of each of them, then ask them to speak in the order that they're sitting. There's some logic to that, and I'll explain that as we go along. Detailed biographies of all of them are on the net. These are all people that are easily Googleable, if you will. But each panelist will spend a couple minutes describing what they did in that era and how it fit into the bigger process of what's been going on. After I get done with the introductions and we start that process, We'll also have questions between members of the panels, and I will interject with some questions to try to bring out things that I think are important to this audience, an audience that's incredibly skilled in propulsion and energy and the overall space and aerospace programs. Depending on the timing, Lieutenant Governor Barbara O'Brien is going to be here to share her welcoming remarks, and so we have a window that we have to leave for her, and then you all have to do your technical session starting at 10 o'clock. So depending on how much time we have, we'll open the floor to questions. We'll have someone come around with cards. We'll just see how that plays out over time. I said the panelists will speak in the order that you see. That's unless they decide to do differently. I have worked with some of these guys in the past, and they are free-willed and will probably ignore almost everything that I ask that they do, but we'll see how that all goes. They made the decisions that put 11 of their colleagues on the moon, 42 of their colleagues into space before that long gap between the end of Apollo, Soyuz, and Shuttle. Yes, I know that there were 12. One of the people here actually was on the moon, and so 12 minus 1 is 11 colleagues. So the math was right. We'll start and end with flight directors, work our way through roles at what's now JSC, the Manned Space Flight Center at the time, Marshall, Kennedy, and then the next to last speaker will be Dr. Schmidt, the guy that sat on the pointy end of the rocket, but as with many of the astronauts, but perhaps more than most, spent a lot of time involved in what was going on behind the scenes to make it all work. Our first speaker will be Jerry Griffin. Jerry went on to become the director at Johnson Space Center. He's a Texas Aggie with a degree in aeronautical engineering. He flew 101 aircraft in the Air Force, was part of the Air Force's, or the nation's actually, earliest unmanned space programs at Sunnyvale. Some of you may be familiar with what those might have been. Was in mission control during Gemini, doing GNC, guidance, navigation, and control. Served as flight director on every manned Apollo mission and was the lead flight director on Apollo 12, 15, and 17. The flight director oversaw a team in a control room that was supported by literally thousands of people across the country. But in the heat of a mission, flight, that's them, talked to a very small group of incredible experts. The next person on our queue, Frank Rensselaer, was part of that group. He was Booster, if you ever listen to any tapes on the communications net. Employee actually of Marshall. He was on the console in what's called the MOCR, the Mission Operations Control Room, responsible for the Saturn as Booster, but his primary expertise was actually in the Saturn 4B, the third stage. He has degrees in engineering from RPI. Frank, I went to Union. If I had known RPI when I invited you, I might not have. They're rival schools a little ways apart. Management from MIT, currently vice president and senior account manager for NASA programs at one of our corporate members, Harris Corporation. Frank wasn't alone in having to deal with issues, and neither were the 17 other people on the flight director's immediate team. That was 17 other people that sat in the MOCR. Each major area had a staff support room physically located just a few steps away from the MOCR. And in an adjacent building, there was NASA and contractor teams and mission evaluation room. And all that sort of was orchestrated by a thing called the Spacecraft Analysis Support Room, or SPAN. It was staffed with senior managers who were not only experts in their own right, that is, they'd grown up in the specific disciplines that they were involved in, but they managed the flow of information into and out of the MOCR as they were asked very detailed questions. Arnie Aldridge, our next speaker, joined NASA in 1959 with the Space Test Group at Langley that became the Flight Control Group at the Manned Spacecraft Center, what's now JSC. He's a fellow of AIAA, graduate of Northeastern University. He supported Mercury and Gemini with positions in the control network and the control rooms, was on the GNC console in the MOCR. For Apollo, he was the chief of the Command Service Module Systems Branch and the CSM Service Rep in the span. So far, we've looked at the functions that manage the flights, that is, in the control rooms themselves. Of course, somebody needed to light the fire under those rockets before there was anything for those flight controllers to do. Nominally, Houston took over at Tower Clear. Bob Seek is a graduate of UVA. He was a test conductor at Kennedy during that Apollo era. Actually, during the shuttle era, he went on to be the equivalent of a flight director, Jerry and Glenn. Was the flight director for the return to flight after the Challenger accident, and for more than 50 launches, Bob? You were the flight conductor? I did a little bit of launch in my past. I never knew how long you could hold your breath until you got to T0. Bob, you must have one hell of a set of lungs. J.R. Thompson is the president and COO of Orbital Sciences, another AIAA corporate member and an AIAA fellow. Actually, Orbital is the home of our current president. J.R. served in NASA as the deputy administrator at headquarters, but for 20 years was at Marshall Space Flight Center. Was the director of Marshall when he left, but has been the manager of the SSME, the Space Shuttle Main Engine Program, and a whole variety of programs and positions leading up to that. He joined Marshall in 1963 as a liquid propulsion manager, and during the Saturn program was most closely involved with the J2 engine. That's seen a rebirth in Constellation with the J2X. 5 of those LOX hydrogen J2s powered the Saturn S2 second stage, and one was the Saturn 4B third stage. Not only allowed that system to reach orbit, but then had to be restarted to do the translunar injection. JR is a rambling wreck from Georgia Tech, degree in aero, and has engineering masters from the University of Florida. Jack Schmitt is the last man to have climbed down the ladder to stand on the moon. That's a very carefully chosen term. And he was the next to last to leave, followed by his Apollo 17 commander, Gene Cernan. Jack was in the first group of scientist-astronauts selected in 1965 and had been named to fly on Apollo 18. But then when the program was curtailed at 17 flights, it was speculated and in fact happened to move that scientist, a PhD in geology, forward into the last flight, so we did have a no-kidding trained geologist that walked the surface of the moon. As you might expect, he did as much training of his fellow astronauts on what rocks to pick up as training he did himself. Well, that may not be quite true, but certainly he did an awful lot of that. He was on the Apollo 15 backup crew, spent more than 3 days on the moon, 22 hours of EVA. They drove more than 20 miles in their rover. Broke the fender. Cernan broke the fender. Brought back over 250 pounds of rocks, including what's characterized as the most interesting sample from the whole program, a troctolite 76535. There'll be a quiz afterwards on why that's an interesting piece of rock. Dr. Schmidt's undergraduate degree is from Caltech. He studied at the University of Oslo and doing research that led to his PhD, which was a PhD in geology from Harvard. He was elected to the Senate following his retirement from NASA, and I'd be willing to bet that walking on the moon was more fun than walking the halls of the Congress. Our final speaker will be Glenn Lunny. Glenn Lunny joined NACA, and yes, I did say NACA and not NASA, at the then Lewis Research Center after graduating from the University of Detroit in the summer of 1958, just before NASA stood up. He transferred to that same space test group. At 21 years old, he was the youngest of the 45 members of that group in 1958. During Mercury, he was a flight dynamics officer at the Cape, and at remote sites, the mission control was done from the Cape for Mercury in the first couple, I guess, Gemini flights before it moved to Texas. In 1964, he and Gene Kranz were selected by Chris Kraft to join Kraft and John Hodge as flight directors. He was the lead flight director for Apollo 7, that first manned flight after the fire and after some other challenging things in unmanned test flights. Many of us, I'm sure, have seen the Apollo 13 movie and walk away with the impression that there was only one flight director. Hardly true. Both of our flight directors here were very, very heavily involved in that. T.K. Mattingly, a longtime friend of AIAA, has described Glenn Lunny's efforts as the most magnificent display of personal leadership that I have ever seen during that program. He was the technical director and then the overall project manager for the Apollo-Soyuz test program, went on to become a shuttle program manager, continued to support the shuttle from Rockwell and United Space Alliance after he retired from NASA in 1985. He's also a fellow of AIAA. So that's the crew, that's the kind of things they've done. So Jerry, let's start with you, and where were you, what did you do, and how did it fit?
Bob asked us to talk a little bit about how we got to where we were in the Apollo program. I got there a little bit differently than some of the other guys here. When I graduated from college, I got commissioned in the Air Force, so I had a commitment, and I spent 4 years in the Air Force. And then I got out and went to work I was at Hamilton Air Force Base. If any of you know where that is, it's closed now. Went right down the peninsula and went to work for Lockheed Missiles and Space at Sunnyvale. And for those of you that might remember, we were doing some very interesting programs, early stuff, Discoverer and Midas and Samos and names like that. And we flew on the Agena as the upper stage in several of those. So I had been trying to get into NASA and just couldn't work it out, but I finally made it. And I actually was pulled in to work on the Agena because the Gemini was to dock with it, and I knew something about the spacecraft. I had been a systems guy. And so I actually went to JSC in 1964 and was going to be an Agena guy, but I was only there about 30 days, and I got shifted over to actually work for Arnie Aldrich and be a GNC, a Guidance, Navigation, and Control Systems Officer. And this was the hardware monitoring and of all the propulsion on board the CSM. And it was a great training ground. When the fire happened, we had a break in the program. I was getting ready to be a GNC for Apollo, and in that break period, Chris Kraft, our big boss, decided he needed some more flight directors, so he named 3 more flight directors, and I got chosen as one of those. So I then worked Apollo 7, which was the next flight, with Mr. Lunny in the lead, and I was the real rookie on that crew. Great start. And from there, I went through the rest of the program, working with all these guys down the line here in one phase or another, all as a flight director. And it was an extremely fun, and particularly to all you young folks in the audience, I hope you get a chance to do it again, because it was the culmination of a great national effort, and we were very fortunate to be in it.
Well, Frank, you were on console in that stuff, and I tried to briefly describe the MOCR and all those folks, but tell us more about you and where you were and what your relationship was to this kind of guy.
Well, this kind of guy over here was a great guy to be working with. Let me start back just a little bit further, though, Bob, that I started out of school. I knew right away in school that I wanted to be part of the NASA team, so I joined Marshall Space Flight Center in 1962. Dr. von Braun was running Marshall at the time, along with a lot of his German compatriots that came over after the V2 days. And my first boss was a German, matter of fact. And we had a great team working it, and of course it's particularly appropriate because part of the conference here is propulsion, and so that's my background. I was primarily working on the S4B stage, the third stage, design of the propulsion systems, and JR was working on the engine part of it. And the first real serious experience I had, I guess, was the third flight, the third stage that was going to be the first manned flight, which would have been a Apollo 8 at the time. I was out of Sacramento. We were doing a full-up test on that stage, and it blew up. And it was the same week as the Apollo fire, and so that was a long, hard week for all of us. But it really sunk in on how serious this business really is, and obviously we all took it seriously. But that was a very traumatic experience for all of us. In 1967, we picked a team to go down to Johnson to be flight controllers, to be responsible for the Saturn V, for the Apollo missions. And as was mentioned before, control went from KSC to Johnson Space Center at Tower Clear, which is about 10 seconds into the mission. And at that point, the booster crowd, which was, I was the booster one, and we had a team on the console. We also had a team in the back room, and I think Arnie will talk a little bit more about that. But at that point, we took over control, so anything happening in real time was, from the Saturn V was the booster responsibility. My first mission was the second test flight, which was unmanned, And I'm sure you probably heard about this or hear more about it from some of the other panel members, but we had 2 engines out on the second stage, and it wasn't clear whether this thing was ever going to get into orbit or not. There were 3 people in the Mission Control Center, the MOCA, that had abort command switches. It was the flight director, it was the flight dynamics officer, and it was the booster. And on the unmanned flights, if you threw that switch, it immediately was an abort. And so obviously, serious times there. The mission rule on 502 unmanned was if you had 2 adjacent control engines out on the second stage, which there were 5, as mentioned, 4 outboard and 1 in the center, it wasn't supposed to be able to control. So there was a mission rule that said we're supposed to abort. But watching the console, and I was actually the backup on that, but the booster one watched it, it did control. We had another problem with the range safety officer. It looked like, as it goes, they call them different gates, but they had an African gate, and if the thing shut off, and the African gate, we were in the African gate, it means it would land in Africa, which obviously was a bad day. So again, the range safety officer was supposed to send a command as well, and we talked him out of doing that because it was controlling, and it did limp into orbit. And the third stage failed to restart, and so at that point, the flight dynamics officer sent the abort switch, and there was an alternate sequence, and the command module did its thing. And I think you guys, Glenn, maybe you or Jerry could comment, but I think that's the only time that the abort switch has ever been sent, right? In the controls. I believe, I was just saying that, Glenn, I think that's the only time the abort switch ever has actually been sent from the MOCA, Mission Control Center. So anyway, that was that experience. And then, of course, we had the Apollo 8 following that, which is a very gutsy mission after all the problems we had on the second unmanned flight. And from that point on, from a booster standpoint, things went pretty well. We did have a kind of a tough row on Apollo 12. We got hit by lightning right off the launch pad, and the booster did great, and command module got reconfigured in orbit and went on to the moon. So it was a great experience being a booster. I was very young. We were all young at the time. My first mission, I was 28, and we did a lot of simulations, a lot of training, and we did a lot of coordination with guys at the Cape, and I'm sure you'll hear more from Bob Seek on that. But obviously a very close coordination there. We had reached back to Marshall Space Flight Center, who I actually worked for at the time, although in real time I reported to the flight director. And we also had on call 24 hours a day, just about any kind of support that we really needed during a mission. The vendors, Marshall Space Flight Center, all the experts there, as well as the people in the back room. So working for guys like Jerry Griffin and Glenn Lunny was just a terrific experience. So it was a good team. That's my background.
So Frank, you were a 4B guy, and yet you were the interface with flight for the whole booster. Did you have to go through any kind of certification process, or did these guys quiz you beforehand to make sure that you had your stuff together? Or
well, when I was there, it actually wasn't a certification so much. It was just trial by fire. We did an awful lot of simulations, and the SimSoup guys, they put together all the scripts, and they tried their hardest to trip us up. So by the time it got to the mission, it was pretty easy compared to the kind of stuff we had to go through during the simulations. But at that time, Bob, to answer your question, no, it wasn't any particular certification. We not only did the simulation, but we had other training from a system standpoint. So we actually, as a flight controller, you end up being a really good systems engineer. So you got involved from structures, avionics, electrical, the whole 9 yards.
Now, Arnie, Frank mentioned the back rooms and the interface to the rest of the world. You were on console during Gemini, but during Apollo, you had a very different role. You kind of ran that process for the command service module, I think. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'd like to comment on that, Bob, because one of the aspects of it is most of the people here at the table that are talking today are all from the flight operation, mission execution standpoint, and as you all know, there were literally hundreds of thousands of design and development people that built this equipment also, and this room that has been referred to is called the Spacecraft Analysis Room with a nickname SPAN, And the purpose of that was to enable a structure that would allow this mission control team that was fully trained and capable and intent on executing the mission and whatever happened, but give them the capability to also draw on the design and development community in real time in an organized and structured way. And I'll get back to that in a minute, but I'd first like to talk a little bit about my early career before we got to something as elaborate as that. I'm really glad, Bob, that you talked about the this being the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo time frame, because to me at least that was a continuum. It started and just flowed through all three of those, one to the other, and they were tremendously connected in what we did and how we did it and what our objectives were. I started with NASA 6 months after they awarded the Mercury contract to McDonnell Aircraft, and 3 months after the first 7 astronauts were chosen. My first role was not to start flying missions, but to participate in creating the Mercury tracking network that was going to support it. There are a number of sites that supported the Mercury flights, but 13 of them were manned flights around the world, and we actually sent flight controllers to each of them because in those days there were no satellite communications, there was no data relay. If you wanted to communicate with a vehicle or look at its telemetry, you had to have a flight controller at the station to do it, and some of the stations had voice communication back to the Mission Control Center, but about half of them, the only communication back was teletype, and that might give all of you a frame of reference in today's technology world, how it was with no satellites for communication, no computers, no email, no Blackberries, none of that. It was pretty manual stuff. A Mercury pass would be anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes over a site, and if you wanted to communicate to the control center, you'd write out a teletype message, hand it to a teletype operator, he'd send it to Cape Canaveral. The guy at Cape Canaveral that would respond would write an answer, give it to his teletype operator, it would come back, and if you're lucky, you could do that in 5 minutes, but it wasn't easy, and most of the stuff was before the fact and after. Anyway, my first job in Mercury was to work on the flight control facilities and the flight control procedures for these remote sites, and we had a capsule communicator and an Aeromed and a Mercury Systems flight controller at each of the sites. They each had a console, and so I worked on setting that up with a whole bunch of people from the tracking network side of NASA. When the mission started, I was a Capcom at Guaymas for the first 2 flights, the Mercury Atlas, and then the second 2, which were manned orbital flights, Enos and then John Glenn. I was the Capcom at Point Aguelo, which is now part of Vandenberg Air Force Base. Both of those sites were the retrofire sites, and we were there to back it up or support it with a ground command if necessary. For the last 3 flights in Mercury, I was the Mercury Systems officer in the Mission Control Center, which in those days was at Cape Canaveral, and those were all one-shift missions, so we didn't have multiple shifts, as was mentioned. For Gemini, after the first manned orbital flight, which was still out of the Cape, we moved to the new control center in Houston, and we moved into the future, which had 3 shifts for every console as we went forward. And for Gemini, I got to be in charge of all of the flight controllers that were there for the Gemini spacecraft. We had 2 positions in the mission control room of supporting these flight directors, and we had 4 positions in what we called a staff support room in the back room. And so I had an organization of about 25 people, half of which were civil service and half of which were from McDonnell Aircraft and from the Philco Tech Rep organization. And we manned the systems consoles. Now we had 10 remote sites for Gemini because some more data automation had come in, and we We manned the 10 remote sites, we manned the 4 consoles in the support staff room and the 2 in the Mocha, and so we had a pretty big operation. I had about 25 people. And we were responsible for all of our preparation leading up to it. The Gemini mission rules, the Gemini, we built a systems handbook for each flight where we drew schematics of every system in the spacecraft that focused on where the telemetry signals were, where the commands could go, how the crew switches interacted, so you could in real time advise and operate the control of the spacecraft. I operated the GNC console, as Jerry pointed out, for each of the missions during the Gemini sequence, but then when we got to Apollo, we had an even bigger operation. Each of these programs, from Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, each one was orders of magnitude more complicated than the previous one, and we got to Apollo, and I now had 50 flight controllers to train and to prepare for and support now 3 different consoles in the mission control room, and we had now 6 consoles in the back room, and we had still early in the program, we still had some remote sites, but by the time we were at the lunar flights, we were now fully automated and had a much, much more capable network than when we began. The subject we started with, the spacecraft analysis, was another staff support room that's just off the mission control room, and my job was to be the CSM management in that room. I was joined by management from the Apollo Program Office and management from the North American Aviation Corporation, who those people interfaced with a building that's right next to the control center that had a whole floor dedicated to what we called the mission evaluation room. And in that room, there were consoles and displays and communications, and some 50 to 100 engineers from NASA engineering and North American engineering were brought in there for the mission to also monitor the flight, but they didn't interact directly with the control team, who had a full job and knew the timing and had to pay attention to what was going on in flight. They communicated through this span, and therefore, for the CSM, through me, to my flight control team on the console. And questions could go either way. They were documented and structured, but even though they couldn't serve you too well in a very time-critical situation, they served very well when there was a little time to analyze things and add to our knowledge for something we hadn't seen before. So we brought those engineering people directly into mission support to participate, and at the plant, and there's a similar organization for this with Grumman for the LEM, by the way, but at North American, there was a control room out there also, which didn't have data displays, but had the communication loops. They supported the mission evaluation room with the engineers that had come to Houston. The mission support room supported the span, who then interfaced directly with these CSM people. Now, if you project that across the whole mission control room, there were other SSRs. Some of them went through the span, and some of them didn't. We had MIT there for the software and the computer that controlled the Apollo CSM and LEM, and so forth. But there was booster, Aeromed, flight dynamics. There's a big flight dynamics support job that maybe Glenn could say something about. Payload, recovery. So when you look at the mission on TV and you see the flight director and the capsule communicator and you see the video of the astronaut, there's a few more people involved, and really that was my job. After the Apollo 15 mission, Chris Kraft asked me to come to the Building 1 at Johnson Space Center and become the deputy program manager for the Skylab program. So that kind of finished my mission operations work, but started a long career in program management.
Okay, let me go back to a specific incident in Apollo that may well have ended up in span, but it didn't have time to, and that was the lightning strike on Apollo 12. You mentioned it, Frank. Jerry, you were the lead flight director. You were the flight director during the launch, and Arnie, I'm sure that when the consoles went blank, a lot of other things started to go pretty blank in your mind in a hurry.
Well, there's another man you ought to have here to talk, because he's one of the geniuses of this business we're talking about. That's a man named John Aaron. He was on the ECOM console when that happened, and everyone in the control room was totally befuddled. John recognized what had probably, this is a lightning strike coming through the command module, taking the fuel cells and one AC inverter offline, and scrambling all of the instrumentation so it was nonsense on all the consoles. And John instantly came up with a call, fed it to the flight directors. It was something they never heard before. The call was SCE to aux, and everybody looked at him like, is this guy been flipped by the lightning too? But they did it, and it restored the instrumentation. The Saturn wasn't affected and put it into orbit, and with the instrumentation back, the CSM was recovered, and in a rev or a rev and a half, we were able to do enough checkout that we were able to commit to translunar injection and go to the moon.
Jerry, the transcripts of that don't go quite so smoothly. It's flight to Aaron saying, "What do you see?" Nothing.
Arnie hit on it. I don't think I got any. Hello.
Can you check the mic here, please?
Lights on.
There you go.
Now, there's a funny piece to that, and I'd share it with you right quick. Arnie hit on it. What happened is about 50 seconds after liftoff, and this was my first launch as a flight director, so I was a rookie in terms of launching, and I thought, my gosh, we may have to abort. We got hit by lightning, figured out later, about 50 seconds after we lifted off. As Arnie said, it didn't affect the good old Saturn IU, it was taking us uphill, and we were right on the right trajectory. So I figured, well, if we're going to abort, we might as well don't get in a hurry, get some altitude so they had plenty of time for the chute to work and so forth. But the Saturn kept us on track. The funny thing that happened, when I went back and listened to the voice tapes, and I remember it in real time, John Aaron, he said, flight having go SCE to aux. And we had never talked about that switch. It was an obscure one in front of the lunar module pilot out of several hundred switches. And I said, what? And he said, SCE to aux, meaning signal conditioning equipment to auxiliary is what it stood for. Well, I turned to the Capcom, who was Jerry Carr, and I said, Capcom having go SCE to aux. And Jerry said, what? And I said, SCE to aux. So like a good Capcom, he called Conrad, said, Apollo 12, SCE to aux. Big Conrad said, what? And finally, John Aaron said, signal conditioning equipment to auxiliary. And so Jerry repeated that to him, and at that point, Al Bean said, I know where that switch is. And he went and he threw it, and then when he did, we got all of our data back on the ground, and that's where John could tell that the fuel cells had been knocked off, and we got them reset and everything went there. But that was a chain of events with wording that was really funny afterwards. It wasn't so funny at the time. But anyway, that kind of tops that one up.
I'd add a footnote to that. The command service module control room at the Cape, of course, we have systems consoles, and they have displays with them with a number of lights, and we did a lot of simulated launches and aborts from that control room. And as Jerry said, some 50 seconds after liftoff, we'd already had tower clear, but that doesn't mean we all go outside and call it a day. We're tied into the mission. Anyway, the lights that came on with that lightning strike looked exactly like one of the aborts that we had practiced, and we were convinced that they had aborted until we tuned in the communication channels and actually heard Pete Conrad laughing about saying, I think we got hit by lightning.
And I'd like to add something to that, to pick on my friend Jerry down at the end. It was his first flight as a flight director, and I was sitting beside him in kind of a riding shotgun way. And as we've talked here, throwing the switch, got the communications, the telemetry back, and we got into orbit and had to realign the platform because it had been doing a lot of tumbling in the command service module. The Saturn and the IU was fine. So we got into orbit, and we usually spent 2.5 revs in orbit checking everything out. So we spent a lot of time checking everything we could possibly find on the command service module or anything else to find out if there was a problem that would prevent us from going to the moon. And we kind of operated on the principle that we're going to keep going until we find some solid reason not to. We'd have to justify aborting it. Well, we went through everything, and probably one of the things that crossed our mind was it's ill-advised to launch in a lightning storm, so don't do it again, but that was for a later lesson. We spent the 4 hours in Earth orbit trying to figure out that we were okay. And at the end of that, we condensed the following discussion. The discussion would have gone like, well, look, we had something happen, but the vehicle flies okay. Saturn, the IU instrument unit is fine. It's likely to be fine again because everything looks fine. The command service module's back aligned with the platform. Everything's looking fine. We have no basis for stopping this thing. So at the end of that discussion that we didn't have, but which we intuited as we went along, Jerry and I looked at each other and we did this. Well,
Why not?
and so we said, Jerry did, that it was a go, and we went on to fly the mission to the moon. It was completely successful. Congratulations, Jerry.
Good call.
The other thing that was, the only other thing that happened on that flight, it was very, very clean flight. The only other thing that happened was we lost the TV on the surface of the moon, so we missed part of the excursion. But other than that,
Explain how the TV was lost.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, my good friend Al Bean, who, those of you that may understand this, I'm a graduate of Texas A&M, and Al went to the University of Texas. And I've never let him forget it. He actually turned the camera to the sun, and that was before later we had some filters and automatic shutdown but he burned out the TV because he pointed it at the sun. I've never let him forget it. And
Bob, take us back to the Cape.
Well, okay, and a few words about the Cape. Of course, that's where the launches occur, but before you launch, you first have to assemble the vehicle and the payload or the spacecraft, and all hardware arrives at the Cape with some assembly required, some more so than others. So we put everything together and we test it and inspect it and then launch it, and the requirements for that to assure that the systems are operating as the designers intended them to, the requirements for that, for the most part, come from the development centers, Johnson and Marshall. And it's our job to put all those requirements into coherent procedures and verify that the hardware performs per the specifications that they levy on us, and then it's okay to give the go to launch. And that's the work that I did for many years down there. Like most of these guys, after completing my military obligation in the Air Force, in my case, supporting missile operations around the country, I ended up with NASA at the beginning of the Gemini program, and I was assigned the system for the biomedical instrumentation. Back in the early 60s, we still didn't have enough information, at least the doctors didn't think so, about the effects of space on the astronauts. So they were pretty much covered from head to toe with medical sensors, electrocardiogram, respiration rate, blood pressure, and even the electroencephalogram in some cases for the brain. Anyway, so our team was the flight surgeons, the technicians, the suit techs, and the biomed techs, and the engineers. And we instrumented the astronauts and tested all of that equipment. It was all hands-on work for us. We didn't have a contractor counterpart. And once they were all suited up and we verified that worked good, of course the astronauts went up in the capsule and we went in the blockhouse, and once they got connected on board, we verified that they had good data and went on with the mission. So that's the way I started, and I always felt privileged as a young engineer at the ripe old age of 25 to be a member of the launch team for the first manned Gemini mission. As Arnie indicated, Apollo was an order of magnitude degree of difficulty. The hardware was more complex. There was more of it. The Saturn V had 3 stages. Of course, there were 2 payloads, 2 spacecraft we flew on every mission, so there's 5 sets of hardware for each mission. We always had 3 missions in flow. When Apollo 11 was on the launch pad, the Apollo 12 hardware was getting assembled and tested in the VAB, and the Apollo 13 hardware, particularly the spacecraft, was going through processing at the ONC building. So we had a factory going at KSC, 25,000 employees. We worked around the clock 7 days a week, and I ended up with most of the third shift work on the command service module. Because of the complexity and the number of systems involved, we established a position, as it were, of the equivalent of a technical test conductor. There was the operations test conductor, the launch operations manager, launch director, but for the technical bringing together the systems that had to play together, we had our equivalent of the mission evaluation room and the span, engineers who assessed how the integrated testing was going, and if there were changes to the procedures or troubleshooting to be performed, the test integration engineer took control of that activity. And we often had to rely on the expertise from either Houston or Marshall to sort out problems, and they occurred often when the procedures didn't play as we had written them, or the hardware didn't act the way the technical requirements from the design centers indicated that it should. So it was challenging work, it was hard work, and what we found that was refreshing to us was the support we got around the clock 7 days a week. Even when there wasn't a mission in place and the MOCR and the control center was fully staffed, we could call the mission evaluation room 4 o'clock on a Sunday morning when you think the rest of the world is sleeping, and they are, and within minutes we would be tied into a teleconference with the subsystem manager for that particular system, the designer, the contractor counterpart, and even the original equipment manufacturer who built the part that we had the question about. And so we enjoyed unlimited resources in the business of putting people on the moon, and I'm sure we wouldn't have accomplished what we did in the big picture if there had not been that commitment and the resources available to pull it off. We worked a lot of issues. We learned a lot in the first couple of missions. By the time we got to Apollo 11, I wouldn't say that the third shift work was boring, but there was not as much of it, as much activity as there were on the original missions. But as you know, we were still learning things, as Apollo 13 proved, when our procedures were part of the root cause of that particular accident. So you could never take your eye off the ball, so to speak, with the work we did. Again, as I look back at it, I worked with or for most of the people on this panel, and it was always a privilege to be part of that great adventure.
Bob, how much of that relationship was personal? Not just a voice at the end of a telephone, but really building a level of trust. I marvel at, you can have a center that's the manager for an element, and Johnson's going to take care of it after it clears the tower, and you guys got to do a check ahead of time. That level of trust among the engineers and all had to be pretty high.
Well, it was, and there were people you talked to, it was the same name, that for that particular system and that particular discipline. So you all felt that you were members of the same team, and you knew the work was important, but you'd say, well, if this person said they worked it, and you can trust what they say, but you couldn't just write it off there. Just because you saw their signature stamp of approval on it meant that it was okay to go. You still had to go through your own process of verifying that everything was within spec and it was okay to proceed. So trust was part of it, but I think what made it successful was the communication and the availability of resources. You could always find the expert that could pass on the needed information so you could disposition the issue.
Let me ask you a different question. And it's from the time the president said go till launch, not a long time, and yet the infrastructure that was built up at the Cape was almost unbelievable. Just thinking through how that would be built and then seeing it happen. Did you guys that were working down there ever step back and say, how can this happen? How can this all get done in time?
Well, at the time, it was not to say that it was just a job, but it was our mission, our work to do it, and the bosses would tell us, look, we're not going to let money get in the way of putting people on the moon. So whatever you need, journeyman engineer, GS-11, I could sign purchase requests for up to $50,000 for sole source procurement. A lot of money in 1964. The point is that it was a whatever it takes, the commitment is there to let us have that availability of that resource, and we did it. It was hard work, but it was rewarding work, and you didn't have to have a highly visible job to feel important. You could work in a building that had no windows in the middle of the night, which I often did, and you knew that you were just as important as somebody pressing buttons in the control center on launch day in front of the cameras. Didn't matter.
JR, you were at Marshall for most of this time, and again, back to what was in place when the president gave his speech, and Saturn V wasn't, it was barely, it may have been somebody's dream, but it certainly isn't documented very well. To build that whole thing, what'd you do? How'd you get there?
Well, certainly, Bob, those were, I think, very exciting times, but at that time, I was, I believe, 27 years old. I was actually down at Pratt Whitney when Kennedy made his speech. And I was working and immersed in the development of the RL-10, LOX hydrogen cryogenic engine. And a friend told me about a position, an opening at Marshall, and so I took it. And the day we left Pratt Whitney, Kennedy was assassinated. So I drove all the way to Huntsville, Alabama, stopping about every 45 minutes to get the status of what his health was, and eventually, he passed on. But anyway, my early days at Marshall were very challenging because of my experience on the RL-10 in cryogenics. Then I was assigned to lead a small team to work with the people at Rocketdyne, particularly on the J2 engine. The job on the J2 at that time, it was really normal development. There was really no pogo problems, no combustion instability like on the F1, but there was a big problem, and that was we couldn't start the damn thing. It required conditioning. It had two applications. As you know, there were 5 of these engines on the S2 stage and one on the S4B, and it had the requirement to restart. And so it was getting the turbo machinery, the conditions just right on the turbo machinery that were the real challenge on the J2. So most of my Apollo days were spent either on a test stand or coordinating a test setup or analyzing test results that led through a qualification. And at that time, there was a lot of interaction, as there is today, with the test stands. And the way we would run some of these conditioning tests on the S2 application, it was we used the recirc pumps. On the S4B, it was more of a long fuel lead that chilled the turbo machinery. And so I never will forget, we did most of the testing out of Santa Susana, outside of Canoga Park at night because of some of the noise issues, and that seemed That seemed to be the agreement that they had reached with the public. And so many a night, I was up there on a hill with counterparts at Rocketdyne and working these test requirements. But when it came to focusing on the restart and how we would condition the turbo machinery for the S4B stage, several of us had an idea, well, why don't we try to envelope the problem? And so let's start with a very long fuel lead, and then we'll work our way back so we know really what works. Well, I think you probably know what happened. A long fuel lead, we put a lot of hydrogen on that mountain, and as soon as we lit the engine, the sky lit up, and we basically burned all the electrical wires on the test stand. So it was a challenging time, but one thing that I look back on it, I never heard a beep out of Marshall or hear my supervisors back there. They must have certainly known what happened, probably knew that I was instrumental in something like that, but supported us 100%. And my lesson really wasn't quite learned until some 15 or 16 years later, when on the shuttle main engine stand down in Mississippi, as most of you probably recall, the main engine was somewhat late in that series, and we were having a lot of rain, and we were trying to get a lot of tests under our belt, and we couldn't here really work on the turbo pumps and change them out because of the rain. So another of my better ideas was to let's build a tin roof over the top of it. And we did that, and of course that allowed us to work when it was raining, but then when we tested, we couldn't remove the roof. And the hydrogen leaks from the engine accumulated one day, and we just lit up all of Mississippi. So it was, there's a lot to test. On the J2 program, for example, we had about 120 engines. That was about a factor of 10 more than we used in the shuttle main engine program. And it certainly impressed in me and ingrained in me the necessity to thoroughly test these engines, particularly on a demanding cycle like the J2 had at that time. It went on to be a very successful program. I think we had one engine shut down, the center engine on the S2 stage. I believe that was Apollo 13. 13. Scared everybody to death at Marshall. We were, of course, the mission went on. They had another problem. We never could tell whether we contributed to the one they eventually had or not. But we had our head down during the mission trying to understand really what happened and to understand it. But as I look back on the Apollo program, we worked hard, we worked very long hours. It was very challenging, it was immensely rewarding, but there was a culture that was, I think, somewhat different than today. Even I've seen it, I don't know if this is the right word, but somewhat change or deteriorate through Skylab and through even the shuttle program. And that is accountability and responsibility, particularly on the young people. It was just an extremely rewarding experience, and somehow it's not the same today, or wasn't the same back even during the shuttle program. Back in Apollo, I don't believe I ever wrote a RID. You just jumped in with your counterparts at the contractor and solved the problem. You didn't have requirements that drove design changes. So it was a different atmosphere, and I think in some way management's got to recapture that before we're ever going to venture out on ambitious goals that are comparable to Apollo. Thank you.
J.R., let me take you back to the second test flight of the Apollo 5. And There were some J2 issues on that flight, if my reading was right. He lost one of the outboard engines on the S2 and then had to shut down the other one on automatic to get symmetric, and then got your way, almost orbited the third stage, also J2, got you there, but then the restart wouldn't go. And without that being fixed, no one's going to the moon, obviously. And yet the test program that couldn't, you guys had to go to an entirely different thought process, go to a high altitude rather than a flight or sea level test for the actual hardware. What was going on at Marshall? How did you think your way through? We still got to make this work, and how, you never quit looking for solutions.
Well, I don't think there was really ever thoughts later in the program that we couldn't make it work. Very early, people like Lynn Wilson at McDonnell Douglas had a big concern that we could ever develop the J2 to restart for the S4B stage. But later on, I think a very fortunate situation we found ourselves in. We had plenty of test hardware. This was something that Dr. von Braun and Eberhard Rees, Willie Moratzik were very strong on. And we had a lot of hardware, and of course, that's money, but Apollo had a good bit of money. And so we had the resources, we had the people to do it, and on occasion we did go to AEDC for the altitude testing to demonstrate that it would work. I don't remember ever having a feeling that somehow we wouldn't be able to make the systems work to go to the moon. It was always a concern, could you have forgotten something or overlooked something, and would it be safe enough? But systematically it worked, and it was a steady drumbeat of test, and that's the way you demonstrate it.
Right?
I'd extrapolate from that, J.R. What's remarkable to me about that is we had a failure in each of the three stages during the second Saturn V flight, and the next Saturn V we took to the moon for the first time with men on board. Now, that is a whole different culture right there in terms of the risk-averse nature of how we deal with problems, and God help us, no failure kind of a thought that goes through the whole structure of our programs today. It's really different, and there are multiple things during particularly Apollo where we had a bad problem, we bootstrapped up, and we didn't repeat it 2 or 3 times to show it was fixed. We went forward. I think that's a very significant aspect.
No, I agree with you, Arnie. I think it's a challenge that NASA and industry has to face as we go forward.
And confidence in each other.
Let me ask J.R. A little bit about the von Braun team. A bunch of people came over after the war, close-knit. All of a sudden, the space program comes under NASA instead of under Army Redstone. A lot of people like you come into the program that aren't part of that initial group. How did that grow? What was von Braun's leadership like?
He was a very, he was a special guy, very charismatic. I was young, probably in my early 30s by the time that I really got to know him. But whenever he came into a conference room, he would go around and he'd shake everybody's hand. And he would go ahead and conduct the meeting. I recall on one occasion I even forget what the issue was, but he said, I want to hear from my senior people. And so he went around the room, and he ended up with Eberhard. And he said the final score from this was 13-3 or something. I forget the number. And he said, and I vote with the 3. And so we win. And he was very tough on the Germans, extremely tough on the Germans. Every now and then in a big conference room, a German would tend to drift off to doze. And on one occasion he took his shoe off. He came behind him and slapped the table like that, and the fella jumped up. But he was, he'd make up for it in a minute. He was a jovial fella. He had a lot of humor, very demanding. But the guy that was really behind him was Eberhard Rees. He was the nuts and bolts of the Marshall Space Flight Center and made it work.
Let me just comment a bit, too. For those that don't know, Eberhard was the deputy to von Braun. But when I joined Marshall, and as I mentioned, my first boss was a German, but, there just was no difference. I mean, we were just one team, honestly, and I never saw any kind of difficulties whatsoever. I just worked together closely, and, of course, they brought an awful lot of talent into the business. So it was a great experience working with those guys.
On Arnie's comment, you have a couple of problems, and then the next launch you go to the moon. Yeah, I mean, it was his leadership, his and Eberhard's leadership that would bore in on whatever the problem was, test it until it was nailed, and then, let's press on and go on.
Jack, they put all this stuff together and then stuck you on top of it.
I'm sorry?
They put all this stuff together and stuck you on top of it.
Oh, yeah, well,
How did you get into this? First group of scientists, astronauts, program was going to go on forever when you probably applied, and all of a sudden it's getting shortened. Tell us about how, and you were probably far more involved, as I understand it, with spilling coffee in the span, which means you actually were in the span.
Yeah,
why were you involved the way you were?
Much to the regret of some of the people here, I was in span at least on one evening. No, I did spend a lot of time in the Mission Control Center. I started, of course, with the USGS. Gene Shoemaker hired me to come and work on some NASA contracts that they had. And soon after I arrived in November of 1964, I arrived in July, and in November of 1964, the results of Harry Hess, Gene Shoemaker, and others in the National Academy bore fruit. Their efforts bore fruit, and NASA put out a request for the fourth group of astronauts to be scientists and engineers. And I read that on the bulletin board there in Flagstaff and thought for about 10 seconds and raised my hand, in a sense, and volunteered. I figured that if some people had a chance to go to the moon and I hadn't volunteered, I'd probably regret it. And obviously now that turned out to be true. Of course, I had to go. In those days, all of the scientists that were brought in, the two groups that were brought in during the Apollo era, had to go to pilot training to become jet pilots and be able to fly the T-38. And that was a very, very appropriate requirement, I think, although I think Deke Slayton had a different motivation for requiring it. He was never very happy with having scientists in the astronaut office. But we all got through pilot training, at least our group did, and ended up in Houston in 1966, the summer of 1966, and began not only the sort of formal training on various aspects of spaceflight that the astronaut office had put together under Al Shepard, but it gave all of us a chance to start to stretch our wings, if you will, and try to find out what the heck was going on at the Johnson Space Center. And I very quickly realized through a recommendation that George Abbey gave me that most of the action was over in flight control. And so Jerry and Griffin and Gene Kranz and Glenn Lundy and suddenly saw me show up over there and try to get use some of their sort of kludged up simulators to learn what these spacecraft are all about. They had put together a training program for their flight controllers, and I jumped into that as much as I could with my other duties. And soon, one of the things that happened very quickly was in 1968, George Low persuaded NASA correctly that a great deal could be gained by flying the C-prime mission to the moon that became Apollo 8. And Frank Borman called me into his office and said, "Jack, would you do the flight planning for our lunar orbit activity?" And I said, "I'd be happy to, Frank, of course." And that put me in contact with somebody whose name hasn't been mentioned but should, and that's Bill Tyndall.
Yeah.
Bill really was the glue that held an awful lot of this activity together in terms of flight planning and procedures that were going to be used on the missions. And with the Apollo 8 experience, then Tom Stafford called me into the office and said, "Jack, I want you to do the same thing for Apollo 10. Well, for Apollo 8, I divided, that was only, what did we do, 10 orbits. 10 orbits. And you could do that on a spiral around the moon. You could draw a diagram and flight plan on a spiral. And Tom said, "I want to have that flight plan. I want to see it." And well, Apollo 10 had a few more orbits, and that spiral started to get awfully big. And that was about the last time anybody even considered trying to diagram a flight plan on a one sheet of paper. But we did. And one thing that had happened, though, in that process, it reminds me of some other names, is that Apollo 8 was so successful, everybody had great confidence in the site that it was targeted to. Remember, we targeted each of these missions to a place on the moon. So we run all those procedures to a real place. And that place for Apollo 8 was the easternmost site that had been selected as a possible Apollo landing site. And we knew something about it. Well, everybody felt very confident about that. So it occurred to me, said, well, if we feel that confident about that site, let's target Apollo 10 to the next site east, and they're going to be there long enough to see a third site. And so in the strategic sense, if we have to have a hold for Apollo for the first lunar landing, we will have experience with 3 sites across the face of the moon. Well, that seemed like a great idea, but I couldn't find anybody in flight control that wanted to redo the data pack. And this particularly, I couldn't get Chris Kraft to think about redoing the data pack until at one of the last meeting that I had with at that level with Chris and others on this subject, Jerry Hammock was in attendance. And we had this view graph in those days with a long list of all the advantages to retargeting Apollo 10. Remember, it was going to fly fairly quickly after Apollo 8. Retargeting Apollo 10 to the next site to the west. And the last bullet was, and will land in daylight in the Pacific. And Jerry Hammock came out of his chair. I don't know whether you were there or not, Jerry, but he came out of his chair and said, all of that and a daylight landing too? And Chris said, okay, we'll do it. And so we took it up to George Low, and I didn't think we had sold it to George Low, and in those days, remember, I've used the phrase a lot, we were working 16-hour days, 8-day weeks. Really were. Everybody was at it. And the meeting was at 9 o'clock at night with George Low, and Sam Phillips was in attendance, Sam being the program manager and one of the giants of the Apollo era. And I made the presentation. Tom Stafford was there, and George looked very, very skeptical about the whole thing. And Tom and I left thinking that we didn't make the sale. The next morning, George called Tom and said, we're going to slip the landing. This required a one-day slip in the launch date. And we're going to slip to May 17th and retarget. And I still have a feeling to this day, although I don't know, that Sam Phillips was the guy that really made the final sale for us on that. Those are the kind of things that are going on. Then in the middle of all that, this was 1968, the President's Science Advisory Council, PSAC, asked for a briefing on the first landing. And they wanted astronauts to give the briefings. And so that put me in the middle, and I was assigned by Al Shepard to do the EVA planning for then Apollo 11, and the first lunar landing. And that got me involved in EVA planning, which I carried through in detail through Apollo 12 before I was assigned as backup on Apollo 15 and actually started training for flights. Also in the middle of all that, I persuaded Jim Lovell to undertake a major revision of the astronaut science training program for lunar surface operations, and that was put underway during that period of time and eventually affected all of the missions to the moon and really made it possible to say that Apollo was one of the greatest scientific experiments that was ever run, in spite of the fact it was not part of the original plan. Let me conclude just by saying that, you know, there's a number of things that have come up here that sort of illustrate what it took to do it in that time frame. Jim Webb asked his engineers, George Lowe and Bob Gilruth and others, to give him an estimate prior to the Kennedy announcement of what it would take to put a man on the moon. And the engineers, you know, went through all the numbers and came up with generally a number around $8 billion in those year dollars. Webb, to his credit, doubled it when he went and asked for the money. And that's why that meant we had 100% management reserve. And these guys have all referred to the fact there was money in Apollo. We didn't overspend that. It did take about $16 billion to land the first mission on the moon. We spent more afterwards for other missions. But you got to remember that management reserve is absolutely essential to take care of those unknown unknowns, many of which have been described here today. And we just haven't had it. We just don't do that anymore. And somebody has to stand up in a responsible position and say, you got to do it. You got to have that management reserve, or you start to slip schedules, and ultimately, many times, you lose programs. Also, you got to have the right tech base to start with. You got to have a management system in place that we gradually developed for Apollo. That catalytic event was extremely important for getting the program off the ground. But again, it's been alluded to, because we were all young, it takes youth. Average age during that period of time in NASA, and I'm sure it was true in all the contractors, was on the order of 25 years. Gene Kranz did an estimate of what it was in the flight control business for Apollo 13 period, and it was 26 years. Today, the average age of NASA, and I'm sure many of the contractors, is 50. Factor of 2 different. We got to change that. And then, most of all, as Neil Armstrong has pointed out in several of his talks recently, there's this question of trust. And we all had it. We all trusted what was going on, and trusted all of these guys to do it right, and they did. And I want to thank you very much.
Jack, let me take you back to the third EVA. And as I read the mission report and Q&A afterwards when you got back, and all, incredible science stuff found on that EVA and the other two before, but certainly that one. But it also brought home the relationship between you guys on the moon through Capcom to Jerry, who was the flight director, who was telling you to, I think the wording was, you need to be moving in case you didn't get that message earlier. What was the relationship between astronauts and the flight control room, especially during a mission?
Well, the primary relationship was trust. I spent so much time with these guys that I felt they were, and I'm sure all the other astronauts did, even if they may not have spent quite as much time as I did. They felt they were part of the team. And if you got a message, direct or indirect, from through the Capcom, you know a lot of people were behind that message. And if they thought that you were running behind schedule and needed to get moving, well, we needed to get moving. There's no question about it. If they said there was a cryptic message that came up every once in a while and they thought your heart rate was getting too high, nobody else knew what it meant, but we did. And you knew that that's what they were seeing, because we had not the instrumentation Bob talked about, but we had enough information to get respiratory rate and heart rate. And that was important information to have, because when you're in that environment and you know that there's a finite amount of time left to complete the tasks that you've set out for yourself and others expect you to complete, then you will tend to let other people watch over those kinds of questions. And you get deeply involved in what you're doing. And I certainly did that, and I worked a little bit too hard sometimes. I know Gene did, particularly drilling holes and things like that, and we just had to trust that somebody else was going to let us know that we needed to back off a little bit. 22 hours on the moon isn't very long. We were in a magnificent mountain valley, three-dimensional geology everywhere. The mountains on either side were 7,000 feet high, so a spectacular place to be. And also, we were already making, right from the very beginning, making discoveries that were challenging some of the basic, and still today challenge some of the basic ideas that scientists have had about the origin and evolution of the moon. So I found it one of the most extraordinary, in fact, the most extraordinary, exciting geological time, of course, of my life. Other things have happened since that have been interesting, but that sort of takes the cake.
There's a, apparently in the actual audio, it's a lot more significant than the reading, but it's some guy named Schmidt saying, it's orange.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that was Station 4, Shorty Crater, and everybody thinks Shorty was named after Shorty Powers, and I apologize to Shorty's ghost, but it wasn't. It was named after trout fishing in America Shorty, who was a character in one of Kurt Vonnegut's books that I was reading at the time. And when we had that particular station had been selected because of a very, very dark crater. It looked very much like an impact crater, and indeed it turned out to be, but it might have been a volcanic crater, and so we had been thinking about, even before the mission, that we might see something unusual at that crater. And as I walked up to the rim, I scuffed up some dirt and looked down, and it was orange. And a very slight tint in the regolith, the debris layer covering it, that was different than what we had been seeing. And then I started to immediately dig a half trench with my scoop and revealed very bright red, orange, and yellow material in the rim of this crater. And that orange soil, as it was called then, now called orange pyroclastic glass, has made it very, very difficult for these people that think the moon formed by a giant impact of a Mars-sized asteroid on the Earth, because that orange soil contains volatile material that probably could not survive such an event. And it also brought our attention to the samples that Dave Scott picked up and Jim Irwin picked up on Apollo 15. It's become known as a green glass, pyroclastic glass, and that has a similar volatile composition that makes it very, very difficult to imagine that an event like I just described for the origin of the moon would be possible. So we still have a lot of thinking to do about the origin of the moon, and partly, in large part, because we found the orange glass.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about Jack.
Uh-oh. This is the guy that on the way home decided he could resign as our flight director.
Well, we had some
take
young
everything
flight
with a grain of
directors.
salt.
And this is kind of an important perspective of Apollo. The first several missions that we flew to the moon was more transportation oriented. That is to say, we were learning how to get out there, how to operate for a while, and then get back. The last three missions were, we called them the J missions. It was a different block of spacecraft. Much more capability, had the rover, had a thing we called the SIM bay, which did a lot of mapping of the moon from the command module and service module that stayed in orbit. And I really think, I've always thought that the last three missions, we really focused on science. We had better tools, we had longer stays, and we had a scientist. Now, one of the things that he told you about, he jumped in bed with the flight controllers. He tempted us, is what he did. He was single at that time. He lived very close to the center, and he always had a refrigerator full of cold beer. So quite often after we would work for 10 or 15 hours at the center, then we would retire to Jack's apartment, and that's where he really got in and got his licks in. But it did something, it bonded us to Jack in a different kind of way. And by the time when I was the lead flight director on Apollo 15 and 17, I was actually going into the field on field geology training with the astronauts here on Earth. And what they would do is select sites very, very nearly as close as they could get to what the terrain looked like where they were going to land. And Jack was instrumental in getting me and then later other flight directors involved, and it made a world of difference. I really got a feel for what they were going through. So Jack, thank you. I never have said that, but well done.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
And it was a good cold beer, a lot of it.
Oh, lots of cold beer.
Yeah.
Lots of great ideas, including one to land on the far side of the moon, but we never sold that one.
Never got there.
Not even Sam Phillips would buy that one. NASA did a book in I think 1975, Missions to the Moon. It's a series of essays by people. The last one is by Jack Schmidt. It's called Great Journeys of Exploration. Back in the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s, there was the Great Voyages of Discovery. And the title is taken from that same thought process. It is an absolutely wonderful piece to read if you ever get a chance to do that. Glenn, you were the youngest guy in that when you started at 21 years old at Langley. You get moved well, from Lewis, then to Langley, then to JSC, and through the entire program. What a time.
Well, yeah, I guess it's the genius of being in the right place at the right time and being willing to jump into it. Yep. I graduated when I was 21, June of '58. By that time, I had several tours at the Lewis Research Center where I worked as a co-op student. Wind tunnels, heat transfer work, thrust reversers, engine test cells, and so on. So I had a lot of that kind of experience, and more than the average fellow would have getting out of college. And the first month I was there, June of '58, this drawing came across my desk, and it was a drawing of what became the Mercury spacecraft, done by a guy named Cadwell Johnson, who I worked with great length later in life. And I came by here, and I was wondering what it was, and my boss was telling me that, well, the guys down at Langley are thinking of building something like this and flying it. So my reaction was, after about 30 seconds of thought, that this looks like it would be a lot of fun. I'd like to work on it. And that was the start. We took work back to Lewis from the Space Task Group guys, did it back in Cleveland. Then I started traveling down there. It got to be all week, coming to Cleveland, back in Cleveland on the weekends. And eventually I moved down there in '59. So in about a year or so, I was down at Langley full time, and it just always just continued to take off. It always had new dimensions and challenged us. As a matter of fact, I was describing to somebody the other day that the problem we had with succession is that we were all being pulled to do something larger than we ever thought we were ready to do, as opposed to being stacked up and waiting. And it was a fun time. It was really dramatic. I would mention a couple things about some observations on Apollo. At the peak of manpower on Apollo, there were about 400,000 people in the country working on it. And they were working on all kinds of things. You see here a representative set of people, and some of us from different disciplines, some from the same, but all those other people were working on all kinds of things to make the Apollo program work. They were building the hardware that flew, both the launch vehicles and the spacecraft and the rovers and the suits and everything else that we needed to fly. They were putting the facilities in place all around the country, especially down with Bob Seek in Florida. I mean, the facilities that got put in at the Cape are just still today are magnificently large and powerful facilities, as any of you would have seen them would know. I was lucky. I was part of what, for this audience, I guess I would call it the mission team. We called it in those days flight operations, and that's as good a term, too, as any. And I just happened to fall into that because when I first started working, I was working on the trajectory aspects of the Mercury program, which included how we would monitor the ascent phase and how would we figure out the deorbits and so on and so on. So we were working on the relatively few trajectory options that we had during a flight that we might exercise some judgment over. And so that's how I got in my first position in the control center as someone who monitored the flight of the vehicle, somewhat similar to a range safety officer, although range safety protects geography and people. We were trying to protect the mission, the crew, from getting to conditions from which the aborts would be not survivable. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And as we moved along with the rest of this team of 400,000 working on the vehicles, We had a team of about maybe 500 to 1,000 people in Houston who were dedicated to the planning, the analysis. We also had the flight control team, and by that I'm referring not to stabilization and control, but rather the team that was in the control center, team of people in the control center, and of course the flight crews. And this team of people was beginning to come together, and there were various catalysts. Probably the best catalyst for bringing that team of people together was Bill Tyndall, the fellow that Jack Schmidt mentioned. But there were lots of heroes, many of them known, many of them unknown, who contributed mightily to that process. So here the rest of this country was building this magnificent hardware, and we were going to get to be the guys who could deploy it and use it on our path to the moon. So our job was, in simple terms, to accomplish the mission as it was defined each time. As a matter of fact, it's been reported here, I would also say for the benefit of the young people, that indeed at that time, because of the nature of the business, we had very many new young people right out of college who within a couple of years would be in the control center making critical decisions. Probably the most famous of which is the Apollo landing, where two guys who were involved in the guidance computer, one in the back room and one in the front, Jack Garman in back, Steve Bales in the front, called that as a go condition to land. And I think at the time they were 24 and 26 or thereabouts, and were representative of the people that we had in the control center at the time. I was kind of an old guy at that time. I was about 32 or so when we landed on the moon. The control center was an interesting place to be because if you think about it this way, it helps to get a picture. It was kind of a hub that was there to support and advise the astronauts from both a mission and a safety point of view. But it had spokes going out to all kinds of places for additional support, what I would call in-depth support. Arnie has talked about the function whereby we tapped into, accessed the government engineering and the contractor engineering teams for assistance during the flight. And by the way, Arnie turned that into a very solid, authoritative system so that when we got answers back, we knew that they had been reviewed by the right people. We knew that it was an authoritative answer. It wasn't just who was on the shift at the time. It was an answer that you could bet your life on, which in some cases we did. And it was a hub for other things. That's a hub out to the recovery forces. It was a hub to interface with Bob's team at the Cape and a variety of other places. But it was always conducted in a way that the relationships were based on the variable that Jack calls trust. They were always that way, and it made for a very strong control center, very capable of being able to do the job that was entrusted to us. I would say when we were doing Mercury, a way to think about Apollo and what was going on is that when we did the Mercury flights, we finished the program. If you were to ask how much of what we have to do in terms of flight operations and the mission and mission control and the integration with the crews and the planners, how much of what we had to do for Apollo did we have under our belt, did we have mastery of at the completion of Mercury? And this is a subjective number on my part, but I would say it was about 5 to 10%. I don't know, you guys might have a different opinion, but it was relatively low. We had then to grapple with all of the problems that we were going to face when we had to go to the moon, because our ships the spacecraft were moving away from the analog design that we'd use for telemetry and command. We were going to digital machines, both in Gemini and Apollo. We were going to do a lot of maneuvering. We were going to do rendezvous, docking, docked maneuvers. We had to navigate out to the moon eventually. We had to figure out how to land a lunar module on the surface, how to use the system we had, how best to incorporate the cues that the astronauts could derive from their observations of what was going on. I had to put all that stuff together. So it was quite a time in terms of doing that. One of the big assists to that and it's an interesting lesson that I don't hear very many people talking about. The Gemini program, which was a two-man ship to explore all of this, including EVA and long duration, etc., was put in place, and we had 10-man flights in the middle 60s, during which time we tried everything that we could in that vehicle to prepare ourselves for going to the moon. And I would say that by the end of Gemini, we were probably masters of 70% of what we needed to know to be able to get there. But the point I wanted to make was there were a lot of people at the time who in typical fashion, the way we look at things, were coveting the budget or the money that was being spent on Gemini, and the Apollo people would have preferred that we cancel it and put all the money into the Apollo development. And you can understand it from their point of view because they were looking at it as a money for development subject. The Gemini program was also rounding out the Apollo team so that the team that had to take care of the mission operations part of the flight did indeed have the experience and the testing that they needed. The Gemini program turned out to be the boot camp for the Apollo team. If you look at the people who flew, the people who were in the control center, a high degree of commonality, and even if they didn't, even if in some cases the astronauts didn't fly, like Jack didn't fly, he was involved in what we were doing and grew to absorb it and to love it as much as he did geology. I was proud of him. But it was a grand time for us, and looking back on it, you know, most of us have feelings now that we probably didn't have time to express in those days. And I think, as you can probably tell from this discussion, and you can tell from any of the people who were involved in the program, in any way, all of which were important and all of which contributed to the success, people who did this loved this work. They loved it, and they loved the fact that it was successful and that they had, each of us had some part to play in making Apollo a success. So it's a grand way to be retired and look back on some of the things that we did, because Apollo clearly is a glowing bright spot for all of us. Thank you.
Jerry?
Yeah, I wanted to make one point that today we've talked a lot about NASA and the contractors, and that's appropriate. It was a superior team and trust and all that. Quite often in Apollo, the story of Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, I think we have overlooked the contribution and the vital importance of the U.S. military. I know many of you in this room are associated with military space, and that was mainly Air Force, of course. But in the early days, had we not had some of the military tracking facilities, we had people, human resources that we actually used, people that came to NASA from the military that helped us in key positions, management positions. We had recovery forces that the Navy provided, and other support and we had communication, aircraft, what do we call those things?
Orion.
Yeah, Orion, yeah. Yeah, and we had the Corps of Engineers with the big facilities that were built. And I think the military sector of getting us there has never been recognized for the great job, and we would not have been able to pull it off without them. And I think we need to take note of that.
Yeah,
Well,
and
an
we took all their
example.
best test pilots from them too, Jerry, remember?
Say again?
And Sam Phillips brought the ICBM management experience, which was a model that NASA did not have a very good grasp of at the time in terms of the staged development of the design process and so on. And
Sounds like
Sam
Rocco.
Phillips brought that to the agency and continues today. It was a terrific addition to the management scheme that NASA was not employing until the fullest, until they came through that bit of training and that bit of carryover from the ICBM program to NASA.
But an example
Arnie?
is that the
Oh, go ahead,
Titan
Bob.
II for the Gemini program was
Titan,
Department of
yeah.
Defense developed ICBM system. The Gemini wouldn't have flown without the Titan II.
And Mercury wouldn't
Atlas
slow without
Redstone.
Atlas.
Atlas, Redstone, yeah.
Arnie, you had a comment you want to make?
I just want to say one more thing to follow what Glenn said, and that is, I talked a lot about CSM, and the most traumatic mission for the CSM and Apollo was Apollo 13. Yeah, but not just CSM, the whole control center was traumatized. When we had the accident 50 hours into the flight, we had never simulated the situation we had to have a recovery plan, but we had a lot of people who dealt with many anomalies and could think quickly and do these replanning things to find a way to see if we could recover. And one of the most critical things was we realized we were going to have to use the LEM, but it was totally powered down. The CSM, we knew we'd need to land in the ocean when we came back, but it was totally powered up, and it was going to run out of the electrical power you'd need at the end if we didn't do something with it quickly. And as I recall, Glenn was the flight director either when it happened or for the shift that followed directly after it happened. And I think the most important thing that happened during Apollo 13 was the plan that Glenn put together that sequenced those things we had to do, thought them through, and put them in place within the time frame that allowed it all to happen, because we could have lost it just fumbling around. If we'd taken a day to figure out what to do, it would have been all over. And I thought that was one of the dramatic things that happened during the Apollo program.
Yeah, I think the movie is a great movie, but it doesn't do justice to the incredible span of people that were involved. And Gene Kranz is quoted as failure is not an option. Glenn Lundy is quoted with saying, "We can never run out of options. You can never quit the process of finding options." And I, as I recall from reading Glenn, the process of moving from the capsule into the LEM and that whole process, you sort of orchestrated that whole thing. And without that, nothing else matters. Kind of real tribute to the entire team. And again, I'm speculating, you guys correct me, but certainly Mr. Krantz was the flight director at the time, but his crew then was basically taken offline to work the problem, and the other flight directors continued to manage that whole mission in lockstep, just making it all work. Any comments anyone wants to make on that, or I did?
Bob,
Jack?
I wanted to follow up a little bit on what has been a little bit explicit, but also implicit in a lot of what has been said, and that is the idea of connections. For example, NASA came out of the long experience with aircraft development and test of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, the NACA. The senior managers, many of the senior managers had that experience base. And then Glenn just mentioned Sam Phillips bringing another experience base, a connection back into other programs that had been successful. And there's one on the political side that I've always found very interesting, and that is the role that Eisenhower played, which most people don't recognize. In January 1960, if you read T. Keith Glennon's diary, Eisenhower personally sent a letter to Glennon saying, "Start the Super Booster program." And we know where that led. And he also, Eisenhower, over the long drawn-out objections of the United States Army, with all the contributions that they made later, and the Corps of Engineers and others, still objected to having the Huntsville group transferred into NASA, the Missile Defense Agency, I think it was called, something like that. But Ike made sure that happened. And he laid the groundwork, and people have to remember this, in spite of the fact you won't find any support for human spaceflight in Eisenhower's speeches that I found yet, he, by those actions, laid the groundwork for Kennedy's challenge to become credible. And again, and if you even want to take that connection back farther, it was on Ike's watch that von Braun was pulled out of Germany instead of ending up in the Soviet Union and his group. So those connections take us back a long, long way. And with the NACA, take us back, I think, to 1914. And it's something to remember, that you have to maintain those connections. And the AIAA is one of the organizations that I think does that, and I congratulate you for continuing that process.
Let me ask one more question, because we have a few minutes, and I apologize that we didn't have time to do Q&A from the audience, but it's something that I've speculated about for years, and that was, it seems like we either were or we thought we were weight constrained at Apollo 11 to only bring back so many rocks, and yet by the time of Apollo 14, we had a transporter. By 15 and 16 and 17, we had rovers bringing back 250 pounds of rocks instead of 30 or 40 or whatever the first number. And I guess I'll start with JR or whomever. How much margin was in that program from day one that we just grew into, and how much did you actually have to do during the program to get more capability out of all the systems, the LEM, the command service module, the capsule itself, and of course the Saturn stack? Was there a margin, or were we actually developing as we went along?
I think there was some developing as we went along, but I believe that there was a lot of margin in that whole Saturn design, the lunar rover, and it was manifest through the testing that was done. It was very extensive, very thorough. I think Frank mentioned one of the stages blew early in the development cycle, S4B, but I can't recall, other than a number of F1 engines that blew up because of combustion instability. And by the way, that problem on the day we launched Apollo 11, that problem was still hanging there. There was a lot of confidence in it, but it wasn't. We didn't really understand the root cause. But through all the testing of all the elements of Apollo, I think that's where the confidence was drawn. And then the leadership, i.e. von Braun and others, took that and built on it and executed the program.
Jack?
And I think senior management, most of my contacts were through the George Lowe and the CCB Configuration Control Board activities and things like that. And my impression was that confidence that JR just mentioned translated up through the management team, both in Lowe's decision in a very trying year for test failures and launch difficulties to push through the Apollo 8 concept. But also, around that same time, Lowe was beginning to move on the development of the Block 2 lunar module, which was significantly heavier. Yeah. And gave us the 3 days capability. As a matter of fact, the Block 2 lunar module could have met the objectives of Joe Shea's design reference mission, which was 4 EVAs. It's just that you had to trade payload against EVA time. And so that gave us the 3 EVA capability, but it meant a confidence that the Saturn was already there in 68, 69 to do these kinds of things later, early in the 1970s. Again, apparently at the senior management level, there was enough dialogue and understanding going on to make these kind of decisions. So the margins, I think, in the Saturn system were there, and I suspect we left a little on the table, even with Apollo 17.
I think so.
Speaking of upper management in NASA, I'd like to tell you a brief story that hasn't been told very many places. Apollo 13, the explosion happened, and my team was on for the rest of the evening. After Gene's team came off, they'd been on all day. So they got off about an hour, and then I was on for a long time, in which time we developed the plan that Arnie was talking about for getting back to the Earth and stabilizing the situation that we were faced with in terms of this abandoned ship routine that we had to go through. But the point of this story is, by the next morning, all of the eagles and stars and brass in NASA showed up in our control center, all of them. There was a room full of them. And I had gone to a press conference to talk to people, and Jerry was coming on duty right after my shift. So Jerry and I went down to the one of the viewing rooms where we collected up all the brass. And I was 32, and Jerry was about the same. We're standing up there, and we're telling him what happened as best we knew, and what the consequences were, and what we did, and what the options were for coming home, and which one we wanted to pick. And then I stopped, and I had one technical question from Deke Slayton, and then Tom Paine, who was the administrator of NASA, said, he didn't ask me a lot of questions. He didn't nitpick or micromanage us. And here we were, 32 years old, looking at him, and he looks at Jerry and me, and he says, "Is there anything we can do to help you guys?" That was all he asked. Is there anything that we can do to help you guys? And, you know, at the time, we took it literally and said, well, you know, we don't think so. We got everything going, et cetera. But later on, as I matured some more, I reflected on that and said to myself, wow, that speaks volumes about the kind of leadership we had in the NASA management team. They were just absolutely terrific. They trusted us and they let us do our job.
And you know, over the years, then we saw, or at least I saw a creep where we were taking decisions higher and higher as we went along. And here were these two kids talking to as Glenn calls them, the Eagles. And that's all Tom Paine said, is there anything we can do to help? And that was about the end of the meeting. And they trusted us to go do it. And we were a bunch of young people. After that, you could start to see that as the agency matured and aged, the decisions started getting pulled up higher and higher. And we saw it, I saw it in shuttle when I was the director at JSC. Well, no, I had just left, and I remember one occasion, and I don't remember the situation, but I remember where the administrator actually made the decision on a go, no-go, and I think it was a launch, and the administrator made the decision. That would have never happened.
We're out of that model.
That would have never happened.
Jerry, Frank, Arnie, Bob, JR, Jack, Glenn, thank you so much. Great time.
Thank you. Shall we go down? Shall we go down?
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you also to Lockheed Martin for their sponsorship and to Orbital Sciences for sponsoring the recording of this session, which will be available on YouTube or something when we finally figure out our web strategy, but Sharon Grace, who's walking across the front, is going to do that. We are very fortunate to have a welcome to Colorado by the Lieutenant Governor. Lieutenant Governor O'Brien is with us. She has an ambitious agenda, she and the governor obviously, for education, health and wellness, and aerospace issues. Colorado is the #2 state in the country in terms of aerospace. Obviously not solely Lockheed Martin, but a great collection of military, civil, and commercial space. She serves as the co-chair of the Colorado Space Coalition and is actively involved in the Coalition of Aerospace States. Actively a promoter of technology, engineering, math education, and a large number of children's programs. Governor, thank you so much for joining us. Please.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome to Denver, the Mile High City. And as I try and remind people when there's a chance they're new to Colorado, as you all know, the altitude can have an impact on your body. So lots of water and taking it easy in the altitude till you get used to it is usually what we recommend to the flatlanders. As you heard, we are home to a very vibrant, robust aerospace industry, second largest in the nation in terms of number of employees. And I think that's the outcome of having a very strong link between our research universities and the aerospace industry, As many of you probably know, we've graduated more astronauts from the University of Colorado at Boulder than any other university in the country. And it is one of the 5 top priority industries for the governor for support in economic development in Colorado. So we are very honored to have you here today and very committed to making sure that at least our part of aerospace is healthy and moving forward, even as we all go through little ups and downs. It's been a very interesting experience to be one of the co-chairs of the Colorado Space Coalition, because most of my work has to do with strengthening education, and in particular trying to make sure that math and science become stronger in our public schools and that more kids are taking serious classes in math and science so that they can go on to major in engineering or biotech or whatever it is as they move through their education. And when you have a job like suddenly becoming lieutenant governor and you find you're co-chairing a space coalition and everyone there has spent their entire career in it and you just walked through the door, you get very humble very quickly. But I think what we all found was a common place to meet around what is the future of this passion that we share, this industry, if we have fewer and fewer kids coming through the pipeline? And how can we make aerospace and space exciting? How can we get kids understanding how you study and apply math and science, and how many career opportunities are going to grow out of that willingness to study hard and look for ways to apply? And I really appreciate it that, you know, if you stay in there and stay the course, you can teach, you can do research, you can work for a great company like Lockheed Martin, you can be an entrepreneur. I met a couple of guys who are living on, I think, chicken broth and a little propane heater in a cabin in the mountains, but they're building something they're just positive is going to transform space exploration. Who knows if they will, but boy, are they excited about it. So just the range of opportunities, I think, are unique in a lot of ways to this industry. It also provides, as you know, really good jobs with good salaries, good benefits, the opportunity for internal promotion. We have about 176,000 jobs in Colorado related to the aerospace industry, which puts us in that #2 spot. We also have a critical mass of resources that are available to aerospace here. We have 4 military commands. We have the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Center for Atmospheric Research. What we do in our Space Coalition is try and make sure that the military, the researchers, and the private sector are meeting to come up with a common agenda for Colorado where these sectors mingle and then put forth an action agenda for both the state, our congressional delegation, and the leaders of our companies. So we are, I think we're in a good place to show that the more these sectors can intersect, the more opportunity, the greater chance for being on the cutting edge is going to come to our companies. We are actively recruiting companies that would like to relocate to Colorado. We have more sunny days than San Diego. So if anyone here is thinking they might like to locate here to Colorado, I'd be very happy to talk to you about that. That's my Chamber of Commerce spiel. But I want to talk now a little bit about the issue of this education stream coming into aerospace and space. As many of you probably know, there are international tests of the 15-year-olds of the 30 most developed countries in the world. And it used to be that Colorado and the nation were in the top 1, 2, 3 year after year on those tests, especially in math and science. We've now, out of those 30 companies, dropped down to 21st for science and 25th for math. So we have not only not held our position, but other countries have caught up to us and surpassed us. And I think that you would agree that that is not the way to sustain the strength and creativity of our aerospace industry. In fact, that's one reason we as a country have been importing so many engineers from other countries. But I think we all know that the visa issues around importing foreign talent are making that harder and harder. We have to grow our own. We also want to make sure that as we talk about the education of our kids and the next generation of leaders and entrepreneurs, that we don't start to approach math and science as just things you drill, 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 that we've got to keep a balance in the schools. And for those of you who are parents, I know you know that there are a lot of kids who are in school just because of the arts classes they can take. But there are lots of ways that arts and STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, can merge together in the lives of the next generation. And even though it's not aerospace, I have talked to people in the video gaming industry, and they want kids who know math and science, but also know art, because that intersection is where the gaming industry lives. So lots of opportunities if we just make sure kids have the strong skills that they need. We have also been struggling in this country, I think, with some cultural issues around education. And I will say this as the mother of 2 boys. I didn't make my kids study as hard as they should, and yet we found time for their soccer team to make sure, they always had the practice time they need. I think we all know that there are so many demands on the time of young people that as a culture we have to get back to valuing excellence in education, excellence in the classroom, and the willingness to do the hard work that it takes to master a subject and get good grades in it and feel you can go on and major in it. Colorado is trying to tackle this by being one of the first states in the nation to completely revise our grade level standards from preschool all the way through 12th grade. And instead of taking Nevada or Texas as our comparison for our standards, we decided to pick the 2 top performing countries in the developed world, Finland and Singapore, and matched our standards against theirs. So we are determined to make sure that our pipeline of kids are in every grade level moving toward what they need to be internationally competitive, and then doors will open for their futures. We also know that we have to find a way to make the teaching profession more attractive so that engineers who are maybe in mid to late career might decide they want to go back into teaching and teach in a high school or middle school and try and get our math and science skills up. Right now, in our national high schools, 1/3 of the math teachers and 2/3 of the physical science teachers never majored in that subject. Most of the time that means they picked up a couple classes at a community college or a summer school because the school needed to fill a slot, and they went in to fill that slot. We need the best and the brightest coming in to teach so that you can hire the best and the brightest when they come out of the education system, and they've really seen what it is to be passionate about these subjects and to be able to do them with creativity and confidence. We also know that if kids start out behind, they almost never catch up. And that if we have kids who are behind in their vocabulary, let's say they come from chaotic homes, by kindergarten or 1st grade, they can be so far behind in their basic skills that they absolutely never catch up. So I know most of you are going to be interested in maybe middle school, definitely high school, definitely college. But when you go home to your communities, when you talk to friends who might be on a school board or might be a teacher, if we can make sure more kids are caught up in preschool and kindergarten, the other teachers will have a much easier time pushing them forward and meeting those high standards of, in our case, Finland and Singapore as they go forward instead of constantly falling behind and staying there. We are part of a national competition that President Obama and Secretary of Education Arne Duncan have created. And I imagine most of you come from states that are just starting to pay attention to this. But they are so concerned about the quality of education, and it's linked to the industries that are going to make us competitive in the future, like aerospace, like having the ability to do space exploration, that they have created a competitive bid process in your language called Race to the Top. Every state is going to be invited to compete. It will be a pot of money of a little over $4 billion. They expect to select 8 states, and they are going to be looking at the states that raise their standards, that find a way to get the best math and science teachers into their schools early in the education continuum, that are willing to create a data system for continuous improvement. Can you imagine this? There's right now very little way to have a continuous improvement system in education. So I want to toot the horn a little bit for United Launch Alliance, because Michael Gass is a co-chair with me of our education reform effort. And United Launch Alliance, with their chief engineer, Matt Smith, I hope he's here today, decided to let a group of us experience their continuous improvement process, but applied to an education reform issue. And it was absolutely eye-opening about the potential of this. And never before have we had the data systems that would let us measure things in increments and look at ways to tweak the system. I know that's something you live with every day, but if there's ways you can go back to your communities and see if you can help your educators get this mindset into the way they work, we can become a 21st century education system with the knowledge and the strategies to make sure we move up in the world and then stay there. The President has talked about this attempt to reinvent education as our moonshot. And I think, especially hearing the panel that just came to us, that the race to the top and education reform, education reinvention can be our moonshot. And I think we also know that once Americans set their mind to something, you can't stop them from getting there. And I hope that we will grapple with not only what we need to stay dominant in aerospace, but that you'll find ways individually to take what you know, what you've experienced, and help your local schools incorporate that so that we deliver on our own moonshot of moving back into the top tier of developed countries for the education system, and in particular math and science for our kids. And that's probably the long-term plan, to make sure that as some of the gray hair in the room starts to retire, and I am with you, it's just that I get to highlight mine and most of you probably don't. You know, a lot of us are going to be retiring. The average age of aerospace engineers is 55. We've got to get young people tackling those tough majors in college and then moving in to fill the great jobs that you all create. So I look forward to seeing your industry be robust and vigorous in the future, and that you will be part of making sure that the education kids get is at the level you need to do the work that's so important for our country. Thank you very much.
What a great message, and certainly resonates with an awful lot of our programs as well. As we break, let me thank Lockheed Martin, United Launch Alliance, and obviously the governor just mentioned them, Battelle and JAXA, all our sponsors, Space News and the California Space Authority, who are also supporters of this program. Encourage you to stop by the exhibit hall. It will open, I guess, right now, but if you have a break between your papers or your technical sessions, please stop in there, see what some of the companies are doing. So some really interesting stuff. And our Passport to the Future program is now engaged with teachers almost as we speak in room 605. Try not to disturb them too much, but if you want to see what we're doing in terms of training teachers, stick your head in there as well. We are now at 5 minutes before the start of the tech papers, so consider a countdown is on. Thanks for coming to JPC and IECEC. Enjoy your stay.